Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's video. This week I will be making the wedding dress worn by Julie Andrews in The Sound of Music. The costumes for this film were designed by Dorothy Jeakins, and she was nominated for an Oscar for her work on the film, but unfortunately she lost out to Phyllis Dalton for her designs for Dr. Zhivago. In 1965, when she was nominated for the Oscar, it was divided into two sections still, a black and white and a colour, and that year was the year that my friend Julie Harris won the Oscar for her designs for the film Darling. The original wedding dress was made in a slubbed silk. It's very hard to find this type of fabric these days because of the way fabrics are woven. They're a lot more finer and not such slubs in them anymore, and also if you do find one like that, it's quite expensive. When I was looking, it was around £30 to £35 a metre, and hardly any shops had one of the quality that would have been needed. So for this dress I'm using this silk, which is the right colour, ivory, but it's obviously, because it's machine woven, hasn't got much of a slub within the fabric, but it's a nice lightweight silk and the correct colour. I will also be doing the veil that goes with the dress. This is made up of two layers, a short layer and then the full length cathedral layer. Unusually, the short layer is worn underneath the longer layer, and looking at the clip today of this scene in the film, I noticed that there was a join in the longer veil. So obviously the fabric that they were using at the time wasn't long enough. I haven't noticed this before, and it's only because I was looking at it on the Blu-ray that I was able to pick up this detail. So let's get into making the dress. I start by cutting out the front and side panels of the skirt. Once these are cut out, I sew the darts into the front panel, then sew the front and the sides together. The bodice front is cut on the bias. You'll notice that there is no side seam, and the front is cut in one piece to the side back. The back panel of the bodice is cut on the straight of grain. Once the bodice pieces are prepared, I sew them together at the shoulder seam. I then sew the piping around the neck edge. To make the piping, I use a bias strip of the silk fabric and encase the piping cord in between. Once the piping is sewn on, I sew the bodice pieces together using the stitch in the ditch method. I then use the same method of sewing the front and side skirt onto the bodice. Then I cut 2 widths of the fabric for the back panels of the skirt. I'm starting to prepare the back panel for the cartridge pleating, so I'm just starting by zigzagging over the edge at the top, which will then be turned under for the pleating. I'm now going to prepare the back panel for the cartridge pleating. Cartridge pleating is a really good way of getting a large amount of fabric into a very small area. I'm going to start by marking along the turned over piece of fabric every ½ inch. These will be the marks for when I sew in the gathering threads. I'll then put these in and pull it all up. Now that the fabric is pleated up, I'm sewing it onto the bodice. To do this, I take a stitch through the edge of the pleat and then sew down onto the bodice and do a couple of stitches to give it some strength. Here I am cutting the sleeves, also on the bias. If you look very closely at the sleeve on the original dress, there seems to be 2 lines of stitching, one on each side of the seam, which to me suggests that it has a zip inserted into it, and then the buttons are sewn on the top and are purely decorative. So I'm inserting a zip using a running back stitch and then we'll sew on the buttons on the top. I then sew all the buttons down the centre back of the bodice. To make the rouleau, I'm sewing a strip of bias around a piping cord, which I think is a size 0 or 00. I'll sew across the end and then sew down along the piping, and then I use the piping cord to turn it through. When sewing on the loops, I do them as one continuous piece rather than separate tiny pieces. I then sew on the facing and hand sew it down on the inside. The hem is turned up 1.5 inches, and inside is a layer of stiff net to help hold the hem in shape. Here I'm cutting the strips of silk 2 inches wide for the bias that goes around the hem. This is machined on one side and hand sewn on the other. And here's the finished dress. I had a really good feeling about this one from when I started adapting the pattern, and I'm really happy with how she's turned out. The only thing that I wish I had done slightly differently was maybe make the collar maybe 1/2 inch higher, but that's the only thing. Even though she's supposed to be a 1930s wedding dress, and there are elements of 1930s in it with the bias cutting of the bodice and the sleeves, the style of the dress is so typical of the period of when the film was made in the mid-60s, with the inspiration for wedding dresses from that time coming from the dress that Grace Kelly had worn at her wedding in 1956. Thank you so much for joining me on this video. Please remember to like and subscribe, and join me again very soon.